Hey guys, so we're 1 month away from being able to watch the movie It, and I don't know about you guys, but for me, I'm the type of person that always needs a refresher course. So I always watch a movie if I'm going to watch a remake or a sequel. I always watch all the other movies beforehand. In this case, I'm also going to watch the miniseries, but I'm also going to read the book, and I left myself with a little bit of time because I like a challenge. But I also decided to do a couple videos, so that way, if you guys needed a refresher course also, then I'll take you guys along for the ride. So I was originally going to try to do chapters 1 through 5, but I forgot how much Stephen King makes one chapter like 30 pages, and then the next chapter like 100 pages. So I don't want to forget anything important, and I'm just going to do them chapters at a time. So we're going to start off with chapter 1. And chapter 1, pretty basic. You're going to get the story. Basically, it's all about Georgie. You know, he's running down the street. He sailing his little boat. And pretty much what you see in the miniseries, they played it out perfectly to how it is in the book. You got Georgie. You got the sailboat going into the thing. You got Bill at home sick. The mom playing the piano, Georgie meeting It, and the death of Georgie Denbrough. But what you don't really get out of a movie or a miniseries or anything played out on TV is what some of the characters go through and what they're thinking. And you don't get a lot of backstory because it's basically showing you what you picture in your head. I mean, it's basically showing you things and you don't get a chance to picture the things in your head. So, in the beginning of the book, it's just Georgie running through the thing, and as he's running down the street, and it's kind of talking about the flood that just happened. It's 1957, and Georgie's dad is out trying to pick up sandbags because it was a flood that they thought was going to take out the town, like destroy their buildings, knock down their houses, and it is now like the day after the big thing, and everything's starting to come down. There's no power. It's still raining, but the worst has passed and the town is starting to ease up a bit. So in the middle of this, it goes from Georgie to kind of like a little backstory about the town. And I don't know if you guys have read a lot of Stephen King or even his son Joe Hill, but they always have something in the books that kind of make you go like what the fuck, or like I'm not gonna say it's unnecessary or whatever, but it's just one of those things that is kind of like, what? And I personally love those kind of things. They're just like little drops of Stephen King. So here's a little bit that I thought it was funny. It's once it goes into the kind of like the backdrop of the town. This is current year is 1957, and it's kind of mentioning the previous flood. So here we go. God knew it had happened before. The flooding in 1931 had been a disaster, which had cost millions of dollars and almost 24 lives. That was a long time ago, but there was still enough people around who remembered it to scare the rest. One of the flood victims had been found 25 miles east in Bucksport. The fish had eaten this unfortunate gentleman's eyes, 3 of his fingers, his penis, and most of his left foot. Clutched in what remained of his hand had been a Ford steering wheel. So that's the kind of little droplets of Stephen King, as I call it. And I even wrote here, why eat his penis? You know what I mean? It's not necessary to the story, but it's just one of those things that he pops in there, I guess, just to have some fun. And anyways, so we go through the whole thing with Georgie, and it kind of goes from him running the streets to kind of like what happened that morning. And one thing, like I said, you can't get in watching a movie is, and especially in Georgie's character, because it's very simple in the miniseries. He's running along, his brother makes him a boat, and he gets taken by It. But Georgie had a lot of feelings, and Georgie was a lot of really scared. And I know in the miniseries they show him a little hesitant when it comes to cellar, but here are just some of the things that poor little Georgie went through. And it's when he has to go into the cellar to get the paraffin. And he's really terrified of the cellar. So he is thinking he did not like the cellar, and he did not like going down the cellar stairs because he always imagined there was something dark down there. That was silly, of course. His father said so, and his mother said so, and even more important, Bill said so. But still, he did not even like opening the door to flick on the light because he always had the idea this was so exquisitely stupid he didn't dare tell anyone that while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist and jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt and wet and dim and rotted vegetables. So you could see how terrified little Georgie was. And but he really wanted that sailboat. And it goes on here. It was the smell of something for which he had no name. The smell of it, crouched and lurking and ready to spring. A creature which would eat anything, but which was especially hungry for boy meat. He's still trying to talk himself into running into the cellar, and he's feeling along for the light switch. His fingers found the switch. Ah, they snapped it. Nothing. No light. Oh, Christ. The power. He forgot the power was out. George snapped his arm back as if from a basket filled with snakes. He stepped back from the open cellar door. His heart was hurrying in his chest. The power was out. Of course. How had he forgotten the power was out? Jeezly crow. What now? Go back and tell Bill he couldn't get the paraffin because the power was out, and he was afraid that something might get him as he stood on the cellar stairs? Something that wasn't a commie or a mass murderer, but a creature much worse than either? That it would simply slither part of its rotted self up between the risers and grab him by his ankle? This is legit. Georgie's a little scared. I mean, it's sad. You know, in the movie you don't really see that, but here you get it. So he walked down the 4 steps to the cellar shelf, his heart a warm, beating hammer in his throat, the hair on the nape of his neck standing at attention. His eyes were hot, his hands were cold, sure that at any moment the cellar door would swing shut on its own, closing off the white light falling through the kitchen windows, and then he would hear it. Something worse than all the commies and murderers in the world, worse than the Japs, worse than the Attila the Hun, worse than the somethings in 100 horror movies. It, growling deeply. He would hear the growl in those lunatic seconds before it pounced on him and unzipped his guts. You really feel for little Georgie here. He does, as you know, jump into the cellar and looks around. And if any of you guys have read it before, you know that there's a turtle. And they didn't fit it into the miniseries. I think that was a smart idea because I would think it was hard to fit in an ancient turtle from another dimension. I have no clue if they're going to attempt it with this new It that's coming out. I would like to see how they would. I think it would be interesting, but they give little droplets of the story that's yet to come. It says, as George sifted through the junk on the shelf as fast as he could, old cans of Kiwi shoe polish and shoe polished rags, a broken kerosene lamp, 2 mostly empty bottles of Windex, and an old flat can of turtle wax. For some reason, this can struck him, and he spent nearly 30 seconds looking at the turtle on the lid with a kind of hypnotic wonder. Then he tossed it back, and here it was at last, a square box with the Gulf in it. He found paraffin. But he's hypnotized by this turtle. So you kind of get like the little droplets beforehand because you know that you wouldn't get it if you're first time reading it. It kind of seems irrelevant, but later on, little things like that. Even when he thinks about it, when his fear is gone from going into the cellar, he thinks about it. He's like, that turtle, George thought, going to the counter drawer where the matches were kept. Where did I see a turtle like that before? Little droplets. Also, that's interesting. They go on to like little moments with Georgie and his brother Bill, you know, calling each other assholes and who's the biggest asshole and things like that. A very playful banter that you don't see in the movie too much. You see like a little snippet of it, but you get more of it in the book. And also what I thought was interesting is it kind of tells, if you guys remember, Bill stutters. They call him Stuttering Bill in the book. And this is kind of like a little explanation. He had been hit by a car when he was 3, and knocked into the side of a building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was that accident which caused the stutter. George sometimes got the feeling that his dad, and Bill himself, was not so sure. So, not important to the book, but just a little thing to kind of explain Bill's stutter, I guess. And I thought this was really sad. As you know, like a lot of this I told you already plays out like the miniseries, but so Georgie's got his boat. They put paraffin on it. It's not going to sink now. And George turned back to look at his brother. Be careful. Sure, his brow creased a little. That was something your mom said, not your big brother. It was as strange as him as giving Bill a kiss. Sure, I will. He went out, and Bill never saw him again. That was sad. That was like the goodbye, and he didn't even know it was the goodbye, but he felt probably that it was a goodbye. And then by page 15, we're in full running mode, running with Georgie down the street. It's raining. In one of the commercials, or one of the trailers that it shows for Georgie runs into the sawhorse, hits his forehead and falls down. Here it says, he put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped, and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice, momentarily caught in another whirlpool, and then disappear. So he didn't bump his head on the sawhorse, but he did take a fall, and then he screams, "Shit and Shanola!" He yelled again and slammed his fist down on the pavement. That hurt too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose a boat. And I'm going to read this part to you guys because, I mean, the interaction with it, I think, is important. And it's only like a page and a half or 2 pages, but it's played out very well in the miniseries, and I just want you guys to hear how it is in the book. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dark, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It kind of reminded him of... Huh? The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there, the sort of eyes he had always imagined but never really actually seen down in the basement. It's an animal, he thought incoherently. That's all it is. Some kind of animal. Maybe a house cat got stuck down there. Still, he was ready to run, and he would run in a second or two when his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock those 2 yellow, shiny eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface of the macadam under his fingers and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around him. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the store drain. "Hiya, Georgie," it said. George blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie where you know the animals will talk and dance. If he had been 10 years older, he would not believed what he was seeing. But he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Denenbrawl was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white. There were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors like gorgeous ripe fruit, in one hand. In the other, he held George's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" The clown smiled. George smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was a kind of smile you just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" "Well, sure." He reached forward and then drew his hand reluctantly back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." "Very wise of your dad," the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. How, Georgie wondered, could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were a bright, dancing blue, the color of his mom's and Bill's eyes. "Very wise indeed. Therefore, I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise the Dancing Clown." Pennywise, meet George Denbrough. George, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Correct?" George giggled. "I guess so." He reached forward again and drew his hand back again. "How did you get down there?" "Storm just blew me away," Pennywise the dancing clown said. "It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie?" George leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts, hot roasted peanuts, and vinegar, the white kind you put on your french fries through a hole in the cap. He could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cheery aroma of Midway sawdust. And yet under it all was the smell of the flood, and decomposing leaves, and dark storm-drained shadows. That smell was wet and rotten, the cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. "You bet I can smell it," said Georgie. "Want your boat, Georgie?" Pennywise asked. "I only repeat myself, because you really do not seem that eager." He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great big orange buttons. A bright tie, electric blue, flopped down in his front, and on his hands were big white gloves like the kind Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck wore. "Yes, sure," George said, looking into the storm drain. "And a balloon?" "I've got a red and green and yellow balloon." "Do they float?" "Float?" The clown's grin widened. "Oh, yes, indeed they do. They float, and there's cotton candy." George reached. The clown seized his arm, and George saw the clown's face change. What he saw was horrible enough to make his worst imagining of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke. "They float," the thing in the drain crooned and clawed with a chuckling voice. It held George's arm in its thick and wormy grip. It pulled George towards that terrible darkness, where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris toward the sea. George craned his neck away from the final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky, which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing all up and down Witcham Street. People came to their windows and bolted to their porches. "They float," it growled. "They float, Georgie, and when you're down here with me, you'll float too." George's shoulders socked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job that day because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker, a small boy who was screaming and writhing in the gutter with muddy water surfing over his face and making his scream sound bubbly. "Everything down here floats," that chuckling, rotten voice whispered, and suddenly there was a ripping noise and a flaring sheet of agony, and George Denbrough knew no more. Dave Gardner was the first to get there, and although he arrived only 45 seconds after the first scream, George Denbrough was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker, pulled him into the street, and began to scream himself as George's body turned over in his hands. The left side of George's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed into the storm drain from the tattered hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky, and as Dave staggered away toward the others already running pell-mell down the street, they began to fill up with rain. So that was the end of Georgie Denbrough. It was sad. He was a little hopeful kid, and it took him out. Pretty sad. Like I said, it plays out a lot like the miniseries, which I think is because, that's the whole reason why I like the miniseries. And I know a lot of people are looking for something a little bit more gruesome and a little bit more terrifying. I did find the original a lot a lot creepy. I think it's more creepy to find somebody, a clown who is unsuspecting and just seems kind of normal and is willing to bait in kids that way. The new one for the trailer seems like a lot of jump scares so far. And yes, I am a Tim Curry fangirl. And yes, I am an original Pennywise fangirl. But I am open to what the new one has to come, and I am interested in seeing what they put in from the books. Chapter 1 finished. I've already read Chapter 2. I'll do that video later. But I just wanted to let you guys know what was going on. Alright guys, Chapter 2 coming up soon, and I hope that helps you out. Bye.